I think the process of unlearning, that is confronting our beliefs and deconstructing exactly how we think about things and things that we take for granted, practices that we have internalized, be it through having gone through an educational system that has conditioned us to think about assessment in a particular way, for instance, is exactly the type of activity that we ask as students to engage in when we're talking about interculturally oriented language practices. So we ask them to constantly question and confront their own beliefs and unlearn what they have internalized. So I would like you to engage in this process with us throughout the session today. Both my colleagues and I believe our presentations very much complement each other in different ways. So we're hoping that they will all lead to some unlearning and relearning of ideas. So let me give you a bit of a roadmap for what we'll be doing today with you. I would like to start. There will be 3 parts to the presentation. I would like to start with reflecting on my own personal teaching and research journey, but I have my in brackets because as I do this, perhaps you might want to engage with your own as well. The other reason I have my in brackets is because we've been talking a lot about subjectivities throughout the conference, throughout yesterday's presentations. And I think that taking this first-person perspective on what my experiences have been and how I've been trying to grapple with some issues may help you also model the types of things that we could do with students in the class about other issues that we've confronted in the intercultural realm. So the second part would be, we'll be talking about this point of no return, this turning point that I reached and that led me to this unlearning of some of these assessment practices. And finally, I will describe or try to lay the path for some relearning, which will help reconcile beliefs and practices. So some of the things that I will talk about, I think, have been touched upon by other presenters throughout the conference. So hopefully they will be reinforcing and contributing to the dialogue that has been opened by them. So the first part, looking back, reflecting on my personal research and teaching journey. So just to give you a little bit of my background, I am originally from Argentina. I studied to be a teacher of English back in Argentina, and when I moved to Australia to do my undergrad, I then became a teacher of Italian first, actually, and then a teacher of Spanish, which is what I am currently doing. I teach first year introductory level courses in Spanish at university. So that's just a little bit of my background, but my own research interests I've always tried to marry with my teaching practices, and they have to do obviously with the intercultural. So when I talk to you about assessment, when I give you the word assessment, what does it mean to me? What does it mean to you? What does the word assessment evoke in your memories, even as a learner? Maybe some people might think, I think about the word accountability. So my question then would be accountability to whom? So is it accountability to the institution, to the program, to the learners, to yourself? We always think of accountability mainly in institutional constraints, within the institutional constraints. Some people may think all of the above, but unfortunately in the higher education context, which is where I practice, accountability discourses mainly mean or are largely underpinned by neoliberal global education discourses in which we're all thinking about measuring, about employability, and I'll touch upon this later on in the presentation. So some other people might think about evidence of learning. That's what assessment means to me. then I might ask, who's learning? Is it only the learner's learning? Is it your learning as teacher? Is it our learning? Whose learning is it that we are collecting evidence of? Other people might go as far as saying, well, it's just a necessary evil. And then I will ask, well, why do it? Why do we have to do assessment? And I really think, and Diodorf's recent publication in 2016 also talks about this question of the why. And I've been trying to grapple with this question myself. And it's this idea of what are the motivations behind the reasons why we assess intercultural learning. And hopefully this will lead you into my point of no return, which I will be coming to very soon. Okay, so again, just to give you a little bit of background, just a snapshot of some of the things that have emerged from my research, research projects and also PD programs that I have run. And initially, for me, assessment became central to the work in which I worked with teachers because, as you know, this internalized belief that we have is that whatever is taught will be assessed, right? So if we don't assess something, we don't teach it systematically. And it's not just us, it's also learners that have these internalized beliefs. So if they think that something is not going to be assessed, they don't want to know about it, they don't want to get engaged in it too much, and so on and so forth. So my initial cycle of research projects got teachers involved in, okay, so if we only teach for what we will assess, then we really need to look at the assessment of intercultural language learning as a way to systematize what we're doing, rather than having an incidental or ad hoc approach to its pedagogy. But as I kept going with my research and as I continued to engage with the literature, renewed understanding of what the intercultural language learning process is all about started to emerge. And for me, it is gaining momentum, and it's giving shape to new ways in which we can conceptualize what we're doing. So when we're thinking about the intercultural, and I have language in brackets because we could also talk about intercultural learning process without the language, but of course language is what my area is all about. We're thinking of subjective, lifelong, all of these adjectives that have been coming up throughout the conference. Whole person, non-linear, liquid dynamic, unpredictable, inconsistent, open to transformation, may progress, may regress, unstable and incoherent. And this is another point that Dervin was making yesterday and in his publications too. Sometimes it may be transgressed or manipulated. We may sometimes sound not very intercultural ourselves on purpose, right? So we've been making jokes about this with my colleagues and how we can manipulate these ideas too. And of course underpinned by what I call the 3 C's, curiosity, criticality, creativity. Going beyond the lingual bias, proficiency or competence paradigms, but in our case, or for me, for us involved in language teaching, always related to language, always mediated by language. Embracing multimodality of pathways to develop it, and of course involving the development of multi-competencies. So I won't describe all of these. We could spend probably a whole session on this, but just to lead you again into this point of no return that I reached. So I kept reading on the literature, so I have this idea of what a renewed understanding of the intercultural might be, the learning process might be, and then I'm confronted with this idea of intercultural communicative competence. So if we accept that intercultural learning is essentially all of those things that we described, how can we describe the outcomes in advance? And I know a lot of you are going to say there are some things we can obviously create for the curriculum, learning objectives and so on. But some of the most interesting things that are going on are things that happen in an unpredictable way because of the nature of the learning process. So how can we create all of these outcomes in advance and attempt to teach and then assess them? So how was I supposed to know that something was going to happen with my students as they engaged in an activity? And perhaps some of these practical and concrete examples will come through in a later presentation within the session by my colleague Michelle. And yet competence prevails as an attractive concept for teachers and researchers alike. And I think Dervin made a good point of this yesterday, talking about the emptiness of the concept too. So competence carries particular associations with its meaning. It has the promise of rendering learning outcomes identifiable, predictable, perhaps measurable. And this orientation, of course, particularly in higher education, aligns with competence-based education, which we know is so enticing for the higher education context. So it's so much so that even some postmodern anti-essentialist perspectives and researchers and teachers continue to engage with it. So we start to see some paradoxes here, which led me to my internal conflict and ultimately to this idea of the Janusian approach to interculturality, or the way we approach our own teaching and teaching practices. So I'll explain a little bit what this meant for me, so you can start to see the paradox there. So on the one hand, we have researchers that defend and put forward the changeability, unstable nature of cultures, and so on. But on the other hand, through their analysis, through their research methodologies, they still resort to the quantification and categories that are essentialist, basically. And also, they limit the co-constructive aspects of what we know is involved in a conceptualization of a learning process that is changeable and unstable. So Zotzman reinforces this point after Dervin, a few years after, and he says, while post-structuralist and postmodern structuralist views on interculturality are decidedly different from the structuralist perspective that we know about, in their emphasis on the fluid, hybrid, generally unpredictable, and so on, they nevertheless continue to use and conceptualize the outcomes and goals of intercultural learning as competence, for some of the reasons I was mentioning before. The assessment dimension of language is no different, it's not an exception. It's just an extension of this Janusian way of conceptualizing what we do. Because we may accept all of these ideas in theory, but then continue to look for assessment instruments to test and measure whatever this construct it is, or however we want to call it. Furthermore, I believe we also start to apply positivistic terminology to these tools, and we start talking about validity, reliability, and generalizability, just to comply with expected or internalized dominant paradigms of what we think people want to hear about our tools. So if we added yet a critical layer to this, we would ask questions, and some of the presenters have talked about this a little bit. So if we talked about this construct of intercultural competence, or however we want to call it, global citizenship, a lot of terminology that's been used interchangeably, we need to ask the question, who is entitled to enunciate the classification of these constructs, whose interests are being served by it. Dervin pointed to the Council of Europe being one of the entities here trying to push for this type of policies using constructs like this. So what discourses does the classification draw upon to define itself? So these are some other questions that may come up. So for me, in my research, in my own journey, which is also changeable as well. I am still learning about what I'm doing with the teachers, with every research project and PD that I'm involved in. So for me, this represented a point of no return, however, in that we now know that process product methodology have to be fundamentally different. So what we know about the intercultural learning process, what we know about the potential outcomes or the unpredictability of the outcomes, and what we know or may not know about how to elicit that learning in practice is essentially fundamentally different from what the paradigms that we are working with. So this has led me to start to unlearn or try to engage with the unlearning and the breaking down of those practices and beliefs. So for me, some of these unlearning strategies have been resisting. This is something, it's really hard, and unlearning is not easy, and yet this is what we ask of our students a lot. So resisting the reification of intercultural language learning for assessment purposes. So resisting this idea that it has to be a thing, a concept, a construct that has to be a rigid and subject to all of the processes that we would normally associate with traditional paradigms of assessment. Decentering assessment from the pedagogical process. So for me, if we start with assessment and what we will going to be assessing, it's just the wrong way to start. And of course, I know a lot of you are going to say, well, I start with my learning outcomes, with my objectives and so on. And I agree with that, but we start to conflate what we want to do, and instead of thinking about or leaving the door open for those unpredictable things that may arise in the classroom. And then considering the failure of assessment as we know it. That's a little bit strong statement, a bit categorical, but the way I think about it is the way in which we have been socialized into assessment counts into this. So what are the paradigms that we are used to dealing with assessment in? So leading on to the third part of my presentation, I asked the question, well, can these beliefs and practices be reconciled with what Dervin called yesterday a realistic, liquid approach, especially for teachers? And don't forget, I do teach from hello, and believe me, not many students in Australia know hola. Okay, so I start with hola from in my classes. So can I be realistic about what I can do in my classrooms? So first of all, we need to keep looking at the literature and what is going on and what shifts are taking place. And we are looking at these shifts. We see this happening, and it is slow. The pace is slow, and the pace will continue to be slow from what we see in the literature to what we can actually do in practice. But we need to be aware of what's happening. So we are seeing a shift definitely from a traditional cognitive instructivist focused on psychometric measurement approach to alternative socio-constructivist approaches. And this is not new. It has been happening. I'm not saying that it suddenly happened right now. It has been happening for a long time. But we've seen, I think we've reached a momentum in this process, and we see it taking more and more shape in practice. Focus on assessment and outcome, from focus on assessment and outcome to focus on the learning process. And in this regard, I'm going to ask for help. Michelle will talk about later with some concrete examples of her practice, and we're going to perhaps get a glimpse of maybe what this process might look like in practice, because I don't think we still understand exactly what processes go on in the learners' minds and in that co-construction and interaction and meaning-making processes in the class. So from a focus on competence to performance in the way we think about it as in performance in the class, not performance for the test. And some interesting things that are coming up too are this shift from a unidirectional assessment done to the learner to a bidirectional cycle of reflection in which assessment is also powerful for me. And not just to assess what happened and how good my program was, and not even show my students the outcomes of their tests or their surveys or questionnaires and so on. So from a teacher-centered perspective to a more learner-centered. And as I said, we've seen shades of this happening in different research and empirical work. So it's not new, but I really do think that it's taking momentum. So we may ask the question, how? How is this happening? For me, instead of continue to focus on assessment, we need to focus on how to elicit this process, how to elicit activities or use materials in a way that will contribute to these learning processes, which I don't think we completely understand yet. But we do know some of the features that are coming up from the literature. So we know there's a focus on process. We know they have to be multi-method. We need to use multi-perspectives. We need to use individual, collaborative, but also peer opportunities for learning. It has to be experiential. It has to be longitudinal. And it has to be subjective. And this is one of the things that is quite difficult for us because it makes us have to get into this vulnerable role with the students too. So we are focusing on promoting and eliciting learners' individual first-person reflective processes that may lead to the questioning, the unlearning of the self and the interpretive, the meaning-making processes and interaction. And this sounds great. How does this happen? I think we are not trained as language teachers to understand even the sorts of questions that may not be leading, that may not be biased, to help the students in that process as it happens in the classroom. So there's a lot of things that have to go on before we feel comfortable, I guess, in leading those conversations. But it can be achieved, I think. So we do have some examples coming up from the literature, and it was interesting yesterday, apart from obviously Lidicott and Scarino, also from Australia with their 2013 book, which has, for teachers, I really think it offers a comprehensive framework, and I'm not going to go into the framework here, but they do have a very comprehensive framework of how to make sure that assessment aligns with all of the interculturally oriented language teaching practices that we are working on, especially in compulsory education. So for higher education, it's a little bit different, and perhaps we need to be looking at things like dynamic assessment, which Glenn Levine talked about yesterday a little bit. So what is this dynamic assessment? Well, the interesting thing about the concept of dynamic assessment is that it does not separate instruction from evaluation. It treats them as two sides of the same coin. So it's anchored in the zone of proximal development, and it's the interesting thing for me too is that it's not interested in a retrospective assessment of what has been achieved, what can be demonstrated by the learner, but in the immediate future of the next learning zone for the learner. So Landolf and Thorne define it as a future in the making model where assessment and instruction are dialectically integrated as a means to move toward an always emerging future rather than a fixed endpoint. And I don't have data here to show you, but I think some of the examples that may emerge from following presentations may give us some ideas of what this might look like in practice too. So with these shifts come new questions and implications. So for me, the need to avoid the conflation of learning and assessment, and starting to think about an integration of instruction and assessment in the way that dynamic assessment was talking about perhaps could be a little bit different. The need for alternative paradigms of assessment, so letting go of those traditional paradigms in which we are no longer doing something to the learner but promoting their engagement in less alienating ways. And by this I mean asking questions such as what Diaz in very recent publications suggests, especially in higher education. How do learners view assessment practices as relevant to their own contexts? So I'm thinking I'm graduating by the end of the third year of Spanish courses, global, interculturally competent learners. What does that mean for them, for their own careers, for their own future? Are my learning goals, my learning outcomes that they see in the course outlines relevant? They're so vague sometimes because we formulate them vague on purpose, right? Sometimes because we think, well, we are not too sure what's going on, what's exactly going to happen in terms of the intercultural, so we try to be vague. So why don't we construct some of those learning objectives with them? So the need for relearning and expanded views of language learning, teaching and assessment, which Lidico and Scarino talk about, we need to think about them in different ways, and especially integrating the intercultural in the classroom. The need for additional research into what learning processes might look like in practice. Still a lot of work that needs to be done in that context, because again, it's all situated. What happens in my classroom with my students, with my questions, may not happen in other classrooms, but it may happen in different ways. So we need to be aware of that. We can't be prescriptive about this. So the need for renewed understandings of our role as subjective teachers and assessors in the intercultural learning process. So we need to accept that what my judgments or what my views may be about what learners think about and how they think about things will be completely different from someone else. And we need to start to accept that that's true, instead of wanting to have a standardized ways of looking at what we should be assessing and the marks that we should be giving to certain aspects of the learning. So the need for further teacher education, of course, and here Scarino talks about assessment literacy. So becoming ourselves as teachers more literate in what the paradigms of assessment, the assessment are, the traditional, the alternative, what do they involve? Why do they talk about and they use certain terminology, and what it is this terminology about? So we need to be to become more assessment literate in order to make our own cases for what we're doing, pedagogically speaking. So more dialogue across educational contexts. A lot of things are happening in Australia at compulsory education level that is not translating into higher education. So we do really need to talk about that. And in our context, I have students in my class that will be future language teachers. So when they get into the education program and they talk about what I did with them, they'll say, well, my teacher didn't really model an interculturally oriented language teaching approach, so how am I supposed to know what that looks like? So these are the sorts of questions that I continue to ask myself. Across disciplines, of course, intercultural communication, education, and always emphasizing the role of language learning. Just very recently, in the last 5 years perhaps, we're seeing intercultural education really taking on this idea that, hang on, the language aspect of our communication is important in what's going on, not just the pure intercultural communication, the way we think about it sometimes. And across continents, which is one of the reasons that I'm here today, and that I'm very happy to see that a lot of the literature is being quoted, started to be quoted across continents. We need to become more aware of what's going on in different contexts. So to conclude, my last slide, so I think we need to move from this idea of best practice and what the dot points that we need to tick, or the checklist that we need, to, okay, let's think about actual practice. What can we do? What do we do? And something that is really difficult to grapple with too, unfinished pedagogies. We can't have a model of a pedagogical model with something that's so unstable. So if we see instruction and evaluation as an interplay, two sides of the same coin, as we were saying, then we can focus on the formulation of progressive pedagogical principles. So practicing pedagogy, just stop looking at instruction, learning outcomes, assessment, and just thinking about pedagogy in and for itself in intercultural language learning. And of course, I'm not naive. I know we face multiple challenges and constraints. Our personal histories and experiences, situated contexts, what discipline we're involved in, our institution, our department, our teaching team. I'm not naive. I know this is a very big challenge in Australia too. So even learners' own set of beliefs and assumptions about what will happen in the language classroom, not the language and culture classroom, yes? So all of this, in my view, is ultimately mediated by the quality of the human relationship that we establish once the door is closed. Okay, so those are my views. I have some references, and of course, I think a lot more detailed data from practice needs to be added to this. But that was my way of introducing also our session in the symposium. So thank you very much.